This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. And this morning I have the pleasure of having Ben Kilham and his wife Debbie over there and our crew that have delivered some apples for Ben Kilham's bears. And all hands on board for unloading the apples. And he's got numbers of bears this year that need to be fed until they fall asleep. If they do, we're going to learn that from Ben. But Ben has been a bear wildlife rehabilitator for several decades. We'll ask him how long. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Ben for many of those years. And Ben, tell us a little bit about how you get into rehabilitating bears, and how long ago?
Well, of course it all started with my dad, Lawrence Kilham, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School who studied birds as an avocation. And he wrote the life histories of the woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens. And we grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around. And in the early days, before I was born and after Phoebe and I were born, the wardens brought us animals. Dad had a license to keep any animal in New Hampshire.
Okay.
He had a federal license for keeping any birds. And it was prior to rehabilitation. And then when rehabilitation came along, Craig Jewett, one of the COs in New Hampshire, said, you guys, you ought to rehabilitate for us.
Okay.
And Phoebe and I agreed. We already had crows and ravens and aviaries at the time, and so we started doing small animals. And I was interested in carnivores, and I knew bears were taboo at that time. There was no formal rehabilitation of black bears. In fact, if the word got out that a rehabilitator had a bear, it was a big problem.
Oh, okay.
And one day a conservation officer came with an 11-month-old black bear cub that he thought had been hit by a car. It turned out it had not been hit by a car. It had the shakes and wobbles and couldn't climb, and it had no infectious disease. And it turned out to have something called lysosomal storage disease, which is like Tay-Sachs in humans and caused by inbreeding.
Right.
And so that first bear was confiscated from me for a lack of a permit.
Okay.
But later that year, Director Norman Doe, or the first director, Norman Doe, Don, called me up and asked me if I'd take that bear back.
Okay.
And we kept it until it couldn't fend for itself and found out what its ultimate cause of its illness was. But later that spring, Frosty Hammond from Vermont had 2 cubs from the result of his Stratton Mountain Bear Project. And he'd heard about what I wanted to do, which is to study behavior of bears.
Yep.
And he interviewed me and asked me if I'd take the cubs. And I said, well, they kind of frown upon rehabilitators and bears. But if you'll call New Hampshire and they're willing to grant me a permit, I'll be happy to take the cubs.
Do you remember what year that was?
1993.
Okay.
The next morning I had a permit in hand.
Okay.
And the rest is history. And in that time we've rehabilitated and released to the wild over 300 black bear cubs.
Wow, over 300. Wow.
Not counting the 44, 45 we have right now.
Okay. Now it was 42 the other day. Have you recounted, or do you take off your shoes?
It's 44 because we had 45, and then we had the little girl with hydrocephalus that didn't make it.
All right.
And, but it's not done yet. There's still more bears, more cubs out there.
They're going to be coming. I know I gave you some early on around then.
Yeah. I remember working with you back and before we can remember.
I remember a name, Squirty was one of the first ones, I think.
Squirty was...
You were still in the old house down in the village.
Yeah. Squirty, you brought her to me. Her den had been disrupted by a logging operation, and the loggers wouldn't accommodate. They had to keep doing what they were doing. And Squirty and her 2 siblings came down. They were 3 pounds and about 6 weeks old. Squirty is now 25 years old and in her winter den.
I can't imagine that would be the case, but she's still
alive
and kicking.
She's been the central focus of my research. I've followed her and all her siblings and
Wow.
how they interact with the wild bears. 3 years ago, at age 65, I got my PhD from Drexel University
Okay.
based on my work with Squirty and her offspring.
Ben is a world-renowned bear researcher and scientist. Absolutely.
So Squirty has been, she's a tremendous bear,
Wow.
and she's quite happily in the wild. I found that they have matrilinear hierarchies, which means she's the boss,
Okay.
and all of her siblings,
Offspring
offspring can stay in her home range as long as they obey her rules.
Okay.
But she also has made friends with unrelated females.
Okay. Really?
There was
Wow.
a female that had no cubs and took her in, a wild female, unrelated female, when I put her into the woods as a yearling, and I actually got false charged by the bear. We called her Moose, defending my cubs from me. And Squirty has paid her back by allowing all her female offspring access to her surplus food.
Okay. Nice.
And so it's reciprocal altruism, a tit for a tat with a time delay. And so when there's no acorns, Squirty can go to Moose's area that's all beach.
Yep.
And when there's no beach, Moose and her offspring can come to Squirty's area that has oak.
For acorns. Wow.
So
Trade off.
Yeah.
They get along.
they
That'd
get
be a good thing for, let's see, us to do.
well, they're like us. Turns out the black bears are the only non-human animal that share our social behavior.
Okay.
So Squirty treats her family members pretty harshly, because for her to share with them, they got to obey her rules.
All right.
And the unrelated females, Moose's offspring, she shows much less aggression towards them.
Wow.
And if
Okay.
you think about us, we sometimes can pretty hard on our family members.
Yep.
But we can get away with it because, they're our closest cooperators.
Right.
And we can always reconcile with a family member.
And they're expected to do that, aren't they?
Right. But strangers, they're also cooperators, but we don't take chances with them
Right.
because
Right.
we might not be able to repair the damage.
Right.
So it's been a remarkable journey with these animals, and a privilege to get to know them as
Wow.
well as I have.
Awesome. So give us a couple of the highlights. What other bears can you remember that were really interesting, that had some unique behavior? Anything besides Squirty?
Well, Squirty, I've known all of her daughters and granddaughters, and I watched the replacement if one of them gets lost to hunting or something else. And Squirty, one year, her daughter SQ2 had 2 males and a female, and one of the people living in her home range called me one night, and he says, I noticed that there's 2 of the cubs that are really frisky and really got a lot of energy, and the 3rd cub is always up in a tree and following behind and doesn't seem to be doing very well. I said, well, that happens sometimes. Moms only have so much milk.
Right.
And if 2 of them are more aggressive on the nipple,
Right.
they grow.
They'll survive.
Yeah, and so it's not unusual to have 3 different sized cubs based on that. Well, about a week later, SQ2 showed up at my study site just about dusk, and she had a look on her face trying to communicate something to me, and I didn't know what it was. And so I had to leave. It was getting dark, and the next morning I went up there, and Squirty was there, and a cub ran up a tree above her. She had a single male cub that year.
Okay.
And the next thing I knew, a second cub ran up a tree above her.
Huh.
And I said, what's going on here? I got a little confused.
Yep.
And the day before that, another neighbor living in the area said there was a cub bawling up a tree that they could hear from their house all day long. And finally by 7 o'clock there wasn't any crying anymore. And SQ2 had been through with her cubs.
Okay.
But Squirty came down and got the 3rd cub and adopted it.
Okay.
The next day she was nursing it
Really?
and caring for it.
Wow.
And throughout that summer, both moms enforced the terms of the adoption.
So it was her grandmother that...
The grandmother took
nurtured
it on, and Grandma liked that cub better than any of her female cubs she'd had of her own. So that was a really unusual.
Wow, that is a cool
situation.
story. Well, isn't that amazing?
And another year, she had a single male cub, and of course the males, they value the daughters over the males, because as you know, the males disperse.
They got out. Yeah.
They get out, and this year she chose not to nurse in June during the breeding season.
Early. Wow.
She stopped nursing the male cub and drove him off.
Okay.
Which brought her into estrus.
Yep. Okay.
And she made it.
So it was only a year old then.
It was it was only 6 months old.
Yeah, 6 months old. Yeah. So usually they stay a year and a half.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
And, which was interesting on many levels, because she knew that if she wasn't nursing, she could get bred again.
Yep.
And the little fella, he did fine because he had her power.
Okay.
He could drive her off food because she didn't want to be nursed by him. And he, because of his stature being her son, he could drive anybody else off food.
Okay. Look how that worked out.
So, so things like that have happened, which are really eye-openers.
Yeah. Tell us about, how did you end up with 44, 45 bears this year? What is unique, other than the things that are so unique for 2020? What's unique about bears in 2020 that
every year
finds you with 44 bears?
Every year seems to be unique. There's a new story every year that comes along, but usually based on a natural food supply. And in 2018 we had 9 summer cubs, spring and summer cubs, and then we ended up with a total of 85.
Wow.
Most of them fall cubs. There were no beech nuts, there were no acorns, and hardly any apples.
Yep. Wow.
So every cub that became orphaned ended up in a residential area.
Okay.
Most of them weighing 20 pounds or less.
By the fall, yep.
Yeah. This year we had a abnormal number of spring cubs, starting with the first cubs on January 27th, where a rabbit hunter's dog had gotten into a den and bit a cub, and he didn't fare so well.
Okay.
And the rabbit hunter euthanized him and then shot the mother bear. An emotional situation. And fortunately, he called Fish and Game. It was in Vermont, and fessed up to what he'd done. And they brought us the cubs, and they were 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. Their eyes were shut.
So they just were barely born, yeah?
They were barely born, a week and a half or 2 weeks old. And they're a huge amount of work.
Yep, you're a full-time mom for them.
that's feeding them 4 to 5 times a day, day and night. Because COVID had started, Phoebe moved over here and stayed with us and shared the duties. But everybody has sleep deprived, and finally, when we have an enclosure that's kind of like one of these bins, a little bit bigger, with 2-foot high ceiling walls, and when they climb out of that enclosure, it's time for them to go somewhere else.
So the playpen.
Yeah, the playpen is when they've outdone that. Debbie doesn't tolerate them very well running around
the house.
People, they think cubs are cute and they'd love to have one as a pet. Well, they forget that, cats and dogs only have 2 dimensions. They go around on the floor. Bears have a 3rd one. They go up.
It's a little tough on the curtains.
A little tough on everything. So, then after that, we had a abnormal number of abandonment cubs. First-time moms, if there's not adequate food, will run out of milk. And as soon as they run out of milk, they come into estrus. The breeding season's in the spring, and off they go with a male. And